Finding the man of your dreams is no easy task.
She was looking for that ultimate thing that she felt that she was missing in life, and having somebody to love her.
When you finally find it, you're willing to do anything to keep it.
She seemed like she was obsessed with him.
It was just lie upon lie upon lie upon lie. None of it made sense.
Do the right thing now. Do the right thing, baby. That's what you got to do. Come on now.
Yeah, but I didn't do anything, no.
When you refuse to lose in love, you just might do the unthinkable.
The desperation is real. She thought that she had no other choice but to do something so extreme.
I mean, women do crazy things for men all the time.
Tuesday, May 15th, 2001. As the sun sets in Houston, Texas, most residents settle in for the night.
Houston is a city that has grown so much within the last couple decades. We have people from all over, from speaking different languages, different cultures, different communities. And so it really is a melting pot and a microcosm of the United States.
While most of the city is fast asleep, a 911 call sends a jolt through the Houston Police Department.
At about 1:30 in the morning, police receive a frantic call from a gentleman by the name of Alex Perez. Alex says that 3 unknown men broke into the home that he shares with his wife, Joanna Rodriguez, as well as their cousin and their newborn baby who was just born 4 days prior.
He's reporting that his wife has been kidnapped along with their newborn child.
Joanna Rodriguez was a vibrant and loving young woman who found her soulmate at a young age.
Joanna and Alex's love story started very early. They grew up together in Mexico and have known each other since they were very young.
So both Alex and Joanna was looking for the American dream.
They both had conversations about moving to the United States to start a life for themselves.
At 21 years old, Alex started coming to Texas to find work.
He began coming to Houston, Texas, because Alex had family here, so it just made sense to come to Houston.
Alex had been going back and forth for a while from Mexico to Houston. But in 1999, he was able to land a stable job in construction for a waterproofing company.
The following year, he and Joanna got married.
Shortly after they got married, she finds out that she's pregnant. Obviously, Alex is ecstatic, with the news.
Alex wanted his family with him, and he decided the best place for his son to be raised was in the United States.
Eventually, Alex saved enough money to bring Joanna to Houston to be with him. They moved into a 1-bedroom at the Sandy Glen Apartments.
They also allowed Alex's cousin, Manny Garcia, to stay with them as well.
On May 12, 2001, Joanna gave birth to a beautiful baby boy.
Life seems to be good. They're working towards their citizenship. They have a brand new baby. They are striving to achieve that American dream.
But just 4 days later, that dream is shattered when the family is brutally attacked in their own home, and Joanna and the baby are abducted.
After getting the 911 call, HPD rushes to the scene. They find Alex and his cousin Manny outside the Sandy Glen apartment.
You could physically see that they were beaten really bad. They both had duct tape still hanging off of them.
The 2 men recount their harrowing experience to officers.
Alex tells police that around midnight, Alex was sleeping upstairs with Joanna in their upstairs bedroom with the newborn in between them. Manny stated that he was asleep downstairs.
So Manny then heard a loud noise. Somebody kicked in the door. He looked up. It was 3 men. And they just started tearing up the house, tossing stuff.
Manny says then he was tied up with his hands behind his back with electrical cords.
Manny said that two of the men rushed upstairs to where Alex and Joanna were, and one stayed downstairs, forcing him to turn over to his stomach, repeatedly asking him, "Where's the money? Where's the money?" Manny tells the man, "I don't know what you're talking about." He heard the man cock the pistol. At this point, Manny becomes scared for his life. Manny tells the man, "My wallet is in the closet." Unfortunately, the wallet only had $80 in it.
The gunman took the little $80 out, and he seemed like he was really upset that it was not more than $80.
Upstairs, Alex was going through his own nightmare.
He says that he and Joanna were asleep with the newborn in between them, and all of a sudden, two unknown men wearing ski masks barged in pointing weapons.
Alex stated that these men were demanding money. So he pointed at the closet where he was storing $1,000 that he was saving up to purchase a new vehicle. He told them to take the money and leave.
Instead, the gunman demanded to know where the drugs were.
Alex just didn't know why. He wasn't a drug dealer. Alex said that the man tied his hands and feet up with duct tape and electrical cords and pistol whipped him pretty severely.
Alex tells police one of the gunmen got a phone call.
He answers the phone, and he says, "I'm inside. Do you want it?"
He then overhears one of the other gunmen saying, "She's outside. We have to go," raising the possibility to investigators that there may be another person involved. Alex then heard the man downstairs yell to the other two men upstairs, "Come on, let's go, and take the baby and the young lady."
A badly beaten and restrained Alex had to watch helplessly as the intruders left with his wife and newborn son.
And to see your wife and your child be taken and you're there helpless, that's gotta be a horrible feeling for Alex. I can only imagine.
Manny said that after the intruders left, he was able to maneuver himself out of his restraints and ran upstairs to help out his cousin, cutting him free with a knife.
He had called the police right away.
Police immediately put out a bulletin to all law enforcement agencies in the state and alert the local media.
The whole city has gone crazy. An Amber Alert has gone out looking for the baby.
And so time is definitely of the essence in trying to find Joanna and her child. The clock is ticking.
In the early morning hours of May 16, 2001, multiple law enforcement agencies in Houston, Texas, have been notified about a home invasion and kidnapping at the home of Joanna Rodriguez and Alex Perez.
3 unknown intruders broke into Alex and Joanna's apartment. They duct taped Alex and his cousin, tied them up. And they then proceeded to take 20-year-old Joanna and their newborn baby. Homicide, home invasion, and the robbery teams of the Houston Police Department arrive at the Sandy Glen apartment complex around 2:40 a.m.
Investigators immediately noticed signs of forced entry.
The door looked like it was kicked in with so much force that bits and pieces of the wood in the frame was just laying all over the place. The investigators then turned their attention to the kitchen and the living room and noticed that it was ransacked.
Officers also observed that phone lines were cut, and in fact, those wires were used to tie and bound the victims.
So on the stairs, they found strands of duct tape. And then when they get upstairs to the bedroom, they find a whole roll of duct tape.
What struck the investigators as being odd was the fact that a baby and a woman were taken. Investigators were trying to figure out why.
Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, hoping to find Joanna and her baby, or at the very least, some answers.
They come upon a neighbor, and the neighbor says, you know what, I had this strange interaction the day before, and it just seemed weird to me.
After learning that Joanna and the baby were missing, it got her thinking about something that was said to her by a resident who just recently moved out of apartment 38. She said she only knows her as Linda, and she had only seen Linda and her husband around the apartment complex for about the last 7 months until about 2 weeks ago when she saw Linda move out.
The tenant says she just saw Linda again the evening before.
While she's taking out her trash, she observes Linda outside of her old apartment. She tells investigators that Linda waves her over, and she gets into the front seat of the car.
They spoke for a little while, passing pleasantries, and while in the vehicle, she noticed an empty baby seat in the back seat of the vehicle.
Linda then shakes her belly and says that she's going to have a baby tomorrow.
The neighbor was shocked because Linda showed no apparent signs of pregnancy, but Linda insisted that she in fact was.
And this wasn't the first time Linda told her she was expecting.
There were repeated stories about how she was going to have a baby. None of that ever came through.
When the supposed due date would come and go, and neighbors would confront her about it, she would get angry and retort that the baby had died.
Detectives agree that this behavior is more than suspicious.
They learned that apartment 38 was rented to a man by the name of Victor Duran and his 42-year-old common-law wife, Linda Carty.
Born in the British territory of St. Kitts and Nevis, Linda Carty was well known for her big heart and kind nature.
She always was smiling, always happy. She kind of reminded me of my mama. She was soft-spoken, real light, tiny voice, just sweet.
Linda never shied away from helping those around her.
While in St. Kitts, she became a special needs teacher for kids, and she also led a self-help group.
In 1979, 21-year-old Linda was ecstatic to learn she was pregnant.
Linda gave birth to her daughter, Jovel, and she was a doting mother. She loved her daughter.
But being a single mother wasn't easy, and Linda wanted more for her family.
So in 1982, Linda decided to leave St. Kitts and come to the United States. She attended the University of Houston and studied pharmacology.
Life was headed in the right direction for Linda, and she longed for someone to share it with. It would take some years, but Linda finally found the one when she met Victor Duran.
Their relationship really took off. Soon, Linda told Victor that she was pregnant, and both of them were really excited.
Unfortunately, their happiness was short-lived.
After a few months, Linda had to tell Victor some bad news. She had lost the baby.
Even though this was an unfortunate experience, it actually ended up bringing them closer together.
After speaking with neighbors, investigators look a little closer at Linda and find she has an unusual criminal past.
She was actually convicted in 1992 for impersonating a federal agent.
What she decided to do was reduce her punishment by becoming a confidential informant.
Investigators learned that Linda was sentenced to 10 years probation with the condition that she worked as an informant for the DEA.
Investigators find out something else interesting about Linda.
The Houston Police Department does a check, and they see that Linda Carty had called in this complaint about being in an argument with these Hispanic males several days before.
Linda had reported that she had been accosted by two Latino males in her apartment complex and that they had pointed a gun at her, and she had seen quite a bit of marijuana inside of their car. She had given the names of these two men, but once police investigated those names, it turned out that Linda didn't know these men at all, and as such, the case didn't go anywhere.
But she left a phone number. So the Houston Police Department called Linda, and they asked Linda if they can meet with her to talk about this interaction with Hispanic males at the apartment complex. They really want to talk to her about the kidnapping. And she then agrees to go down to the Houston Police Department to give a statement.
You know what this looks like, right?
I had nothing to do with it, and I don't have to sit down here and lie and tell you. I had nothing to do with it.
May 2001, Houston, Texas. Investigators are desperate to find 20-year-old Joanna Rodriguez and her newborn son after they were kidnapped from their apartment. They are now looking at 42-year-old Linda Carty, a former tenant, as a person of interest.
There's just too many strange coincidences about Linda Carty. Making several lies about her pregnancy and making a strange report about being accosted by Hispanic males in the very same apartment complex.
Hoping to track down Linda, detectives locate her ex-common-law husband, Victor Duran. He agrees to speak with detectives at the station.
Victor appears to be genuinely confused about what exactly is going on. Victor tells detectives that he met Linda 3 years ago, and she moved in to help him recover from an injury that he sustained at work.
But months into their relationship, Victor admits he started noticing some troubling red flags.
She told him she worked with her brother, who was a detective, and she always seemed to have money. But, he never saw her working.
He also said that she always rented cars all the time, but he never knew why.
He says he suspected Linda was involved in something shady.
He didn't want to get involved in whatever Linda was doing. And so at this point, he just asked her to move out.
And that's when Linda claims that she's pregnant. Victor tells investigators that Linda tells him 3 separate times that she's pregnant with his baby.
In the first 2 instances, Linda eventually told Victor that she had miscarried.
Earlier that month, when Linda told him she was pregnant for a 3rd time, he decided that enough was enough.
At that point, Victor is not comfortable in this relationship, because if you're lying about being pregnant, what else are you going to lie about?
Victor says that he pays the last month's rent and finally moves out of the apartment.
Victor tells investigators that he did hear from Linda the day before.
Then he says Linda called him on May 15th around 10:30 p.m. This is the night before the incident happened, and she tells him that she's going to have a baby boy by tomorrow.
She says that she is staying at the Hampton Hotel and that she wants Victor to be with her, but he refuses. He says that he received several calls with her repeatedly asking him to be with her, and each time he says no.
Detectives send a team to the hotel to look for Linda.
But when they enter the hotel room, they find nothing but baby items.
Everything is telling investigators that Linda is likely involved somehow in the abduction. But where are Joanna and her baby? Detectives make contact with Linda's daughter, Jovel, and bring her into the station.
Jovel seemed to confirm that Linda miscarried 3 times. And that was the reason why all the baby items was there.
Detectives ask her if she has any information about Joanna or her baby. But Jovel says she wasn't in town. although she does inform them that while she was gone, she loaned her car to her mother.
She also rented a car for her mom, so her mom could get some of the items out of the apartment and move it to storage.
Investigators take that information and head to the storage unit, hoping to find Joanna and the baby being there.
Investigators speak to an employee there who remembers Linda renting several storage units just days before the abduction.
Linda told her that she was expecting a baby boy. In fact, Linda tells this employee that she's already in labor.
Then Linda returns to the storage unit on May 15th around 6:30 p.m. As she stayed for about an hour, and she was seen retrieving a couple baby items, including a blanket, a few outfits.
The employee tells the detectives that Linda was driving a tan car when she came to the storage unit. And Linda tells her that she had the baby already, and that the baby was home with his father.
She lied to so many people about being pregnant, to even her own daughter, her husband.
Investigators track down Linda and bring her to the station for questioning.
Do the right thing now. Do the right thing, baby. That's what you got to do. Come on now.
Linda ultimately tells the Houston Police Department, "I think I know what's going on."
May 2001. Houston detectives have zeroed in on Linda Carty as a possible suspect in a home invasion and abduction.
With the web of lies that Linda has been spinning, detectives know that they have to come down pretty hard on Linda to get her to tell the truth. And Linda tells them that she is an informant for the DEA, and she gives the officers her DEA handler's name.
Linda had not been an active DEA CI for about 4 or 5 years, but she had this relationship with her handler for a number of years thereafter.
Linda's former DEA handler, Curtis Miller, sits down with Linda to try to get to the truth.
We've been too close too long. Do you know anything about it?
He's pleading with her to tell any information that she knows about this case. And Linda is holding her guns at this point.
Do the right thing now. Do the right thing, baby. That's what you got to do. Come on now.
Yeah, but I didn't do anything, though.
Linda eventually admits that she didn't tell detectives everything.
Linda then says that she loaned her rental car and her daughter car to some guys that could know something about this abduction.
Because they were out there scoping the area.
Detectives ask why they chose that family.
Apparently looking for drugs or something.
How would they know they were even drugs, sweetie?
The first time he came over there, he asked me if I know how much drugs they have in there, because somebody tipped him off and told him that they had a whole bunch of drugs.
Linda says one guy's name is Chris, but she has no clue where they got this information.
Anything about the baby? You know where the baby's at?
If anything, if they have the girl, they're going to have the baby.
But detectives aren't buying her story.
Linda Carty repeatedly lied. It was just lie upon lie upon lie upon lie. None of it made sense. None of her lies make any sense.
There just seems to be, there's a lot of gaps in your story.
It's not a gap. I'm just trying to tell you what little I've
hear you.
heard.
I've been doing this job for a long time, okay? I've worked many home invasions. Nobody goes in and does a home invasion for more than dope or money. They never take a child.
Finally, after several hours and multiple rounds of interrogations, Linda says she might know where they are.
Give me a part of town or something. Think, mother, think hard, because we need to get that woman back, and we got to find that little baby.
I can take you to where I know. They hang out.
Linda shows police to a house on Van Zant Street.
When they get to Van Zant Street, they find 2 cars, both of which are linked to Linda. One car is owned by her daughter. There also is one car that Jovell had rented that Linda was driving.
When investigators approach the cars, they fear what they'll find. But in a sigh of relief, their long search finally comes to an end.
In the car is the baby, with the car running, the air condition running, and the baby is remarkably okay.
Investigators called emergency crews who rushed the baby to Children's Hospital in an ambulance. And of course, they notified the baby's father, Alex, who naturally rushed to the hospital to be with his child.
Inside the car, they find items used in the home invasion, along with what Linda had removed from her storage unit.
In the cars, officers find duct tape, Lysol wipes. They have ropes in there. There's just baby clothes, a baby bag.
It is incredibly incriminating evidence.
But there is no sign of Joanna.
While the officers were by the vehicles, they noticed a foul smell. So they proceeded to open up the trunk, and they found their worst fear.
There is just an extraordinary level of heinousness and cruelty to this offense that makes it different.
I never in a million years would have thought that she was going to do that.
After an intense interrogation, on May 16, 2001, Linda Carty leads Houston investigators to a house on Van Zant Street, where they find Joanna Rodriguez's missing baby, as well as Joanna's body.
Her arms and legs were bound with duct tape with her arms behind her.
Her mouth and nose had also been covered with a plastic bag that had been taped tightly around her neck.
She obviously had been suffocated.
This woman who had just given birth to a baby is dead in the trunk of Linda Carty's car.
Linda is immediately arrested for aggravated robbery and capital murder. Detectives confiscate her cell phone to be analyzed for evidence as police swarm the house and property.
They find a man named Chris Robinson inside. They immediately arrest him.
Linda refuses to talk anymore, so detectives shift their attention to Chris Robinson. Realizing he's facing a capital murder charge, Chris starts talking.
He gives a taped confession. In the confession, he places himself and Linda at the scene.
Robinson admits to investigators that Linda Carty is the ringleader who set the whole thing up.
She's a wicked lady.
Chris says that Linda Carty recruited him and two other men, Gerald Anderson and Carlos Williams.
What was Linda's scheme or plan?
She conned us.
Conned you into what?
Conned us into going in a people's house and had us thinking it was a dope house. She told us, she said she was about 1,000 pounds.
What Linda tells these other people is that in this apartment, there are hundreds of pounds of marijuana. And she wants to go and do what's called a kick door, kick it in, take care of the people in the apartment, and steal the marijuana.
She tells them that the woman in the apartment, Joanna, is 9 months pregnant.
She had told us that baby was her husband's baby.
She starts telling them her common-law husband was having this affair with Joanna Rodriguez, which was completely a lie.
And she claimed that Joanna ended up getting pregnant by him. So in Linda's mind, the baby that Joanna was having was really hers.
And what she tells them is, you all can get the marijuana. I want the baby.
And what did she promise you in return for robbing the house?
Whatever we can get out the house, we all bust it down, you know what I'm saying?
Chris claims they plotted for 3 days.
She told them the layout of her apartment, which was identical to the layout of the victim's apartment.
Chris also claims that Linda bought surgical scissors to remove the baby.
She had already bought all this stuff. She had already premeditated the baby, the kidnapping, everything.
This was not some aggravated robbery that went bad. This was meticulously planned by Linda.
On the night of the 15th, Linda decided it was go time.
They break into the apartment of Joanna Rodriguez and her husband.
But after restraining the two men and searching the home, he says they didn't find any drugs. That's when Linda called Gerald.
Linda basically said, well, they must have moved the drugs somewhere, and everyone was pissed.
They also told her that Joanna wasn't pregnant.
Linda didn't know that Joanna had already had the baby.
But Gerald Anderson gets on the phone and he's talking to Linda, and Linda says she wants the baby.
He said that they gave Linda the baby. However, they didn't know what to do with Joanna.
He says Linda told them to put her in the trunk.
She is put into the trunk of Linda Carty's car. Williams and Anderson are leaving with Joanna Rodriguez. And as Chris Robinson is leaving the apartment, he sees Linda carting a baby. Linda gets into her car, owned by her daughter, Jovelle.
Chris says they all regrouped at Van Zant Street.
And they're fighting. Chris Robinson leaves the property for a little bit. When he comes back, he sees Linda Carty in the trunk of the car.
She was trying to kill the lady. She was trying to suffocate the lady.
How do you know that?
Because she had a bag on her head and the bag was stuck to her face.
And he now understands that there never was any marijuana. That this was all about Linda getting this baby.
Chris states that when Linda went to the station with police, she left the baby in the car.
It was hot that day, and Robinson said he started the car and turned on the AC for the baby.
After Chris Robinson's confession, investigators arrest Gerald Anderson and Carlos Williams at their homes and charge them with capital murder. As prosecutors plan for trial, a new piece of evidence emerges that further proves Linda's involvement in the brutal crime.
They get Linda's cell phone records back. The cell phone records show that she called Gerald Anderson 11 times on May 16th between 12:50 a.m. and 2:50 a.m., which were the exact times of the home invasion.
Prosecutors are confident that they have a solid case against Linda Carty.
If found guilty, she could receive the death penalty. Summer 2001, Houston, Texas. Prosecutors are preparing for the capital murder trial of 42-year-old Linda Carty.
She was arrested for aggravated kidnapping and capital murder for abducting Joanna and her baby.
Linda can avoid the death penalty by pleading guilty, but instead she chooses to maintain her innocence. In February 2002, she goes to trial.
Prosecutors say that Linda is a cold-blooded, manipulative con woman who was the mastermind of the murder and kidnapping of Joanna Rodriguez.
They say it all started with Linda and her man.
She seemed like she was obsessed with him. Like it was some type of, weird obsession.
There are multiple times where he is clearly dissatisfied with the relationship. And Linda's way of keeping him in the relationship is to constantly tell him, I am pregnant.
Eventually, Victor caught on to her ruse.
The problem is Linda couldn't have another child of her own.
Linda's plan at that point, in order to salvage the relationship, she needs a baby. And she just doesn't need any baby. She needs a Hispanic baby because her common-law husband is Latino.
And it just happened to be that she knows this neighbor is Hispanic. She seen Joanna was pregnant. That's what clicked in her mind. I'm gonna take her baby.
They say that's when Linda devises an evil plan.
She calls in a fake police report that she had had an altercation with several Hispanic males with guns outside the apartment complex to create some sort of diversion. She starts telling people that she is going to start having a baby in the next several days.
That's when Linda convinced 3 other drug dealers that she knew that Alex and Joanna were big drug dealers and had a whole bunch of drugs in their home.
Prosecutors say that after she got Joanna's baby, she knew she had to kill her.
Because Joanna Rodriguez could identify Linda. She was desperate to maintain this relationship with her common-law husband, and she was willing to resort to capital murder to get him back.
Despite the overwhelming evidence against her, Linda refuses to admit she did this to keep her man and insists all she did was loan out her cars.
One thing that is particularly clear is that Linda's a liar. All of the evidence is so incredibly compelling that Linda Carty did this.
And the jury agrees. On February 19th, 2002, Linda Carty is convicted of the murder of Joanna Rodriguez. She is sentenced to death.
When they gave her the death penalty, I was in shock because it was a horrific crime. And for her to be a mother, for her to think to do that to someone.
Following Linda's conviction, her 3 co-conspirators hoped to avoid the same fate.
Anderson pleads to aggravated kidnapping and is sentenced to life in prison.
Robinson pleads guilty to aggravated kidnapping and is sentenced to 45 years in prison.
And Carlos Williams was found guilty to kidnapping and was sentenced to 20 years in prison.
I was overjoyed, like relieved, that her family would get some justice for Joanna. So I was relieved that nobody got away with it.
As of today, Linda Carty has exhausted all of her appeals and is now eligible for an execution date.
As for Alex and his son, after the trial, he felt like it would be best if he went ahead and moved back to Mexico.
This was just a really sad case, and you have such loss, and for what? It just was altogether really sad and tragic.
I don't understand that. I mean, women do crazy things for men all the time, but that's like...
The clock strikes midnight, and while a sleeping world breathes in the deceptive safety of the dark, the blacked-out tactical vans of a specialized federal task force tear through the quiet suburban streets of New Jersey, their headlights extinguished, their engines humming with the low, menacing growl of an impending reckoning. Inside those armored hulls, operators clad in heavy ballistic nylon check the seals on their gas masks and slide high-capacity magazines into their automatic weapons, their hearts beating to the rhythmic, cold countdown of a tactical interception that has been 21 years in the making. They are moving toward a nondescript, split-level home at the end of a dead-end street, a residence that has stood as a monument to middle-class normalcy, complete with a perfectly manicured lawn, a family sedan in the driveway, and a welcoming porch light cutting through the thick summer humidity. But beneath that calculated veneer of domestic tranquility lies a secret so toxic, an atrocity so profound, that its sudden exposure is about to shatter the collective consciousness of a nation and rip the mask off a phantom who thought he had outrun the absolute velocity of justice. This isn't just an ordinary police raid. It is the explosive, long-awaited collapse of a wall of silence that was erected in the blood-soaked summer of 2005, a notorious cold case that became a synonym for institutional failure and community trauma, now rushing toward its violent, clinical conclusion under the cover of a moonless sky. The target sitting in that dark house isn't expecting a dynamic entry. He has spent more than 2 decades convinced that the city had forgotten his face, that the forensic dust had settled permanently over the evidence, and that the screams of a young mother missing from her living room had been successfully absorbed by the shifting tides of time. But the law does not sleep. It merely waits, tracking the molecular traces of guilt across decades of human shifting until the coordinates line up with the precision of a laser sight, and as the lead vehicle swerves hard onto the gravel driveway, blocking the exit pathways and sealing the perimeter, the acoustic stillness of the night is shattered by a flashbang explosion that signals the definitive end of a 21-year-old lie. The origins of this nightmare reach back to a stifling hot Tuesday afternoon in July 2005, a time when the world was distracted by foreign conflicts and the rapid acceleration of the digital age, entirely unaware of the localized horror unfolding in a quiet residential development just outside the metropolitan sprawl. A 26-year-old schoolteacher, known throughout the valley for her vibrant laughter and unwavering dedication to her students, returned to her home after a morning spent organizing summer reading programs at the municipal library. Her house was situated in a neighborhood known for its safety, a place where children rode bicycles without supervision and back doors were left unlocked during the peak of the July heat. Her husband, an engineer working for a civil firm in the city, arrived home at 6:15 p.m. to find the front door unlatched, the air conditioning unit running at full capacity, and a half-prepared lunch sitting on the kitchen counter next to a glass of melting ice. The television was tuned to a local news station, casting a pale, flickering glow over an empty living room where the family dog sat shivering in the corner, its behavior a silent, terrifying warning that something completely foreign, something intensely predatory, had breached the threshold of their security. There were no signs of a traditional burglary. The electronics were untouched, the cash in her purse remained sitting on the entry table, and her vehicle was parked in its designated spot in the garage, its engine cold. It was a sudden, absolute vacuum, a violent erasure of a human being from the center of her own life that left behind no bloodstains, no signs of a struggle, and no physical tracks on the polished hardwood floors. The response from the local police department was an immediate, high-intensity mobilization that quickly spiraled into a chaotic scramble against a ticking clock that was moving far too fast for the investigators on the beat. Bloodhounds were deployed across the grid, their frantic barking echoing through the suburban streets as they tracked her scent from the back patio to the edge of a dense wood line that bordered the state highway system, only to lose the trail entirely on the dry gravel shoulder of the road. It was as if she had stepped off the surface of the earth, entering a vehicle with someone she either trusted completely or someone who possessed a weapon so imposing that she was denied even the opportunity to scream for assistance. The initial canvass of the neighborhood yielded dozens of reports from well-meaning residents, but their statements were a frustrating tapestry of contradictions. A blue sedan seen idling near the mailboxes, a utility worker with an unmarked clipboard walking between the houses, a distant sound of a car door slamming at approximately 2 p.m. Each lead was pursued with a desperate intensity that bordered on panic, every construction site checked, every storage unit searched, and every registered offender within a 50-mile radius subjected to grueling, multi-hour interrogations that returned the same maddening result: absolute nothingness. Suspicion settled over the community like an invisible, suffocating rot, transforming a neighborhood built on mutual trust into a fortress of paranoia where lifelong friends looked at one another through drawn curtains and locked doors. The media descended upon the valley like a flock of vultures, their satellite dishes dominating the skyline, their anchors broadcasting live from the front lawn of the missing teacher's home, transforming a private tragedy into a high-octane public sensation. The search terms Notorious Cold Case and Matt Titch became permanently linked to the town's name in digital search algorithms, a digital scar that defined the region across the nation. Parents refused to let their children play in the front yards. Home security systems were installed on every brownstone, and the carefree innocence that had characterized the summer months was replaced by a quiet, pervasive dread that remained long after the television trucks had folded their dishes and moved on to the next horror. The primary investigator, Detective Thomas Vance, became a phantom within his own department, his desk buried beneath mountains of tips, psychological profiles, and vehicle registration logs, his eyes permanently bloodshot as he retraced her final known movements over and over again, searching for the one microscopic detail that he must have missed. As the months bled into years, the case file grew into a monstrous, multi-volume testament to the limits of mid-2000s policing, its pages turning yellow under the harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct storage facility. The initial fury of the investigation began to lose its structural momentum, slowed down by the cruel, inevitable erosion of time and the arrival of newer, more immediate acts of violence that demanded the attention of the short-staffed detective bureau. Vance watched with a bitter, internal rage as the case was officially moved from the active rotation to the cold case ledger, a bureaucratic euphemism for an investigation that was dead in the water, requiring a miracle of science or a sudden confession to ever see the light of day again. The husband of the victim, his life completely hollowed out by the unresolved mystery, eventually moved away from the state, unable to bear the sight of the kitchen counter or the corner mailbox that had witnessed the exact moment his future was stolen. The house on Elm Street was sold to a young couple who knew nothing of the tragedy that had preceded them, the walls covered in fresh paint, the overgrown hedges trimmed, the physical arena of the abduction completely sanitized by the march of progress. Yet, the silence that hung over the 2005 file was not a permanent peace. It was an intermission in a long-term forensic drama that was waiting for the outside world to develop the tools necessary to break the opacity of the past. By the mid-2020s, the field of forensic genomics had undergone a revolution that rendered the technological limitations of 2005 completely obsolete. The tiny, degraded trace of biological material that Vance had collected from the unlatched front door handle, a sample that had been classified as insufficient for traditional STR testing during the infancy of DNA profiling, was sitting in a temperature-controlled vault in Albany, its molecular structure intact, holding the genetic signature of the predator like an encrypted code waiting for the right computational key. That key arrived in the form of high-resolution touch DNA extraction techniques and investigative genetic genealogy, a process that could take a handful of skin cells and translate them into a digital map of an individual's entire family tree. The breakthrough did not originate with a dramatic tip or a sudden crisis of conscience from a witness. It began with a quiet, routine audit conducted by a new generation of analysts at the State Crime Laboratory who looked at the 2005 evidence boxes through the lens of data science rather than traditional street work. The degraded sample was subjected to advanced next-generation sequencing, a process that reconstructed the broken strands of DNA and generated a complete, unassailable profile of an unknown male contributor. When that profile was uploaded into public and private genealogical networks, the algorithms bypassed the false alibis and the dead ends that had frustrated Vance for decades, tracing the genetic lineage back through generations of families until the network narrowed down to a single, specific branch that converged on a man named Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton was 54 years old, a respectable logistics coordinator for a regional shipping firm who had spent the last 2 decades building an unblemished record of community service, domestic stability, and quiet professional dependability. In 2005, he had been a private contractor working for a residential delivery service, a position that gave him a legitimate, unquestioned reason to move through the safe streets of the valley without drawing a single glance from the neighbors or the police patrols on the block. He possessed the access, the mobility, and the specific physical strength required to execute a rapid, silent abduction during that 5-minute window when the schoolteacher was completely alone in her kitchen. The realization was a sudden, staggering blow to the task force. The monster wasn't a transient drifter or a registered offender who had fled the state. He was a regular guy who had simply changed jobs, moved 2 towns over, and allowed the infinite, chaotic noise of the modern world to bury his tracks. The decision to move in with a midnight raid was driven by a tactical assessment of Pendleton's logistical capabilities and his deep, historical familiarity with the geography of the tri-state area. The surveillance teams, watching his house through long-range thermal optics for 48 hours, reported that he maintained a collection of hunting firearms and an array of security cameras that monitored the perimeter of his property. A daytime approach risked a barricade scenario or a high-powered rifle standoff in a crowded suburban neighborhood, a complication that the federal prosecutors wanted to avoid at all costs. The tactical team wanted absolute control over the environment, an overwhelming deployment of physical force that would disorient the suspect and prevent him from reaching for a weapon or attempting to destroy any electronic records that might hold the location of the victim's remains. As the tactical vans line up on the dead-end street, the operators move with a fluid, synchronized grace of a unit that has practiced this entry hundreds of times in dark shoot houses, their movements completely silent until the heavy iron ram hits the front door frame with a sound like a small explosive charge. Federal agents. Search warrant. Down on the ground. Do not move. The shouting is a form of non-lethal acoustic warfare, filling the narrow hallways of the split-level home, paralyzing Pendleton's decision-making process before his feet can even touch the floorboards of his master bedroom. He is swarmed within 3 seconds, his body pinned to the carpet by 4 operators, his hands secured behind his back with heavy plastic zip ties, his face illuminated by the bright, white beams of tactical flashlights that cut through the darkness of his bedroom. The man who had successfully hidden a horrific sin for 21 years stands in the center of his living room in his underwear, his chest heaving, his silver hair disheveled, looking around the room with the wide, terrified eyes of an animal that has finally stepped into a trap it didn't see coming. The grandfatherly mask, the respectability, the domestic peace, all of it has vanished in the span of 90 seconds, replaced by the raw, pathetic reality of a captured predator whose time has completely run out. On the kitchen table, the agents are already setting up portable evidence bags, cataloging his phones, his computers, and his old logs from 2005, while outside, the blue and red lights of the support units finally flare to life against the windows, signaling to the entire neighborhood that the shadow that had been haunting the valley for a generation has finally been dragged into the cold, clinical light of day. The shockwave from the midnight raid is currently ripping through the community, a profound, shuddering realization that the past is never truly dead and that the monsters we fear don't always live in the margins of society. Sometimes they are the people who manage our logistics, who wave to us from across the street, and who sit next to us at the local diner while carrying the secrets of a grave in their hearts. The arrest of Arthur Pendleton has shattered the stagnation that defined this case for 21 years, turning a notorious cold case into a live, high-intensity prosecution that will force the city to confront the details of a tragedy that it had tried so hard to forget. The search for the schoolteacher's remains is now an active, coordinated operation across 3 counties, driven by the data seized during the raid, a final, necessary effort to lift her out of the darkness of the unknown and restore her to her proper place within the history of her family. The final chapter of this long, dark journey is being written in the interrogation rooms of one police plaza, where Pendleton sits beneath the harsh glare of the lights, faced with the unassailable weight of his own genetic data and the meticulous, ground-level police work that refused to let his file burn. There is no triumph in the precinct bullpens tonight, only a heavy, systemic fatigue and a deep, quiet respect for the process of justice, a process that requires more than just luck. It requires an unyielding, multi-generational commitment to the belief that no crime is too old, no secret is too deep, and no victim is ever truly forgotten. The long-delayed reckoning has arrived, and as the convoy of police vehicles moves out from the Brooklyn dawn, their sirens dark but their purpose clear, the valley can finally, after the longest and most agonizing of winters, breathe out its terror and begin the slow, necessary process of healing. The echo of the flashbang that shattered the suburban stillness of New Jersey did not fade. It transformed instantly into the high-voltage hum of a precision criminal processing unit operating in the deep underbelly of the federal detention facility in Manhattan. Arthur Pendleton sat in the center of Processing Room C, a space defined by seamless stainless steel tables, stark white cinderblock walls, and the constant, rhythmic hum of a digital surveillance network capturing every micro-expression flaring across his weathered face. He was dressed in the standard, oversized orange jumpsuit of a maximum security detainee, his cuffed hands resting on the cold metal surface before him, the heavy iron chain linking his wrists to a secure bolt in the floor rattling with every shallow, frantic breath he drew. The transition from his quiet, split-level home to this clinical cage had taken less than an hour, executing a psychological dislocation so absolute that his mind was still visibly struggling to anchor itself to the reality of his exposure. Outside the thick glass of the observation deck, the administrative machinery of the Joint Task Force was moving with the velocity of an active battlefield operation. The midnight raid had yielded more than just the physical capture of a 21-year-old phantom. It had initiated a massive, synchronized forensic triage of the electronic and physical evidence seized from Pendleton's residence. Federal tech units, working under high-priority emergency search mandates, had already bypassed the encryption protocols on his personal laptops, his modern smartphones, and a dusty array of external hard drives discovered hidden behind a false panel in his basement workshop. They weren't looking for standard data. They were looking for the digital footprint of a survival strategy, logistical records, hidden map coordinates, or old text files that could provide the geographical key to the missing schoolteacher's final resting place. Detective Thomas Vance, his hair now completely silver, his posture hardened by 2 decades of carrying the toxic weight of the 2005 failure, stood at the shoulder of the lead digital analyst, his eyes fixed on the terminal screen as the indexing software unspooled the contents of a backup directory from the mid-2000s. Vance didn't feel a sense of triumph. He felt only an icy, burning determination to ensure that the procedural architecture of this arrest remained flawless. He had watched the initial investigation collapse in 2005 under the weight of dead ends and primitive technology, and he had no intention of allowing a high-priced defense team to find a single constitutional loophole in the state's modern forensic net. "Look at the regional routing logs from July 2005, Vance directed, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the authority of a man who had memorized every minute of the day the schoolteacher vanished. He was working a private delivery contract for a medical logistics firm that week. Check the GPS transponder data from his delivery van. The company used an early-generation satellite tracking system for their high-value pharmaceutical shipments. If those files are backed up on that drive, we can map his exact physical coordinates during that 3-hour window after she disappeared from her kitchen." The analyst's fingers flew across the keyboard, entering the command lines that sliced through the archaic file structures of the old hard drive. The screen flared, a sequence of alphanumeric data points popping up on the monitor, a compressed archive of historical telemetry data that had remained untouched since the autumn of 2005. The system began translating the raw coordinates into a visual overlay of a red line tracing the movement of a white Ford Econoline van through the suburban grids of the valley, moving with casual precision until it reached the intersection of Elm Street at exactly 1:42 p.m. on the day of the abduction. The line stopped there for precisely 11 minutes, the exact window when the air conditioning was left running, and the half-prepared lunch sat melting on the kitchen counter. The visual confirmation struck the room like a physical shockwave. The data was an unassailable anchor, a forensic bridge that connected Arthur Pendleton to the physical arena of the crime scene with a mathematical certainty that no alibi could survive. But the red line didn't end at Elm Street. It surged forward, accelerating away from the residential development, turning north toward an isolated, industrial sector of the Meadowlands, a region defined in 2005 by disused shipping yards, deep marsh canals, and massive, unsecured landfill operations that were constantly being reshaped by the city's concrete waste. The tracking data showed the van entering a restricted construction zone off Route 7 at 2:15 p.m. and remaining stationary for 44 minutes before returning to its routine delivery route. He buried her in the marsh foundations, Vance whispered, his fist tightening against the edge of the desk until his knuckles went white. The state was pouring the concrete supports for the logistics bypass that exact week. He used his delivery access to get past the security gates, deposited the body into the open trench before the night shift poured the base, and let the industrial expansion of the city do the work of concealment for him. The focus of the task force shifted instantly from data analysis to a high-priority recovery operation. While the coordination teams contacted the state engineers to secure structural blueprints of the logistics bypass from 2005, Detective Sarah Lynn stepped into interrogation room C to initiate the face-to-face confrontation with the captured predator. She carried no folders, no binders of data, and no presentation charts. She brought only a single, clear plastic evidence tray containing a small piece of metal, the original front door handle from the Elm Street house, its surface tagged with a barcode that linked it directly to the next-generation touch DNA extraction report from the state laboratory. Lynn sat down across from Pendleton, her movements slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of emotional inflection. She placed the tray on the stainless steel table between them, the sharp, clinical glare of the overhead LED lights reflecting off the polished chrome of the handle. She didn't speak for a long, suffocating minute, allowing the heavy, electric silence of the room to press down on the suspect's consciousness until his eyes drifted down to the piece of metal, his chest heaving as the weight of his situation became completely unavoidable. "You know what that is, Arthur," Lynn began, her voice dropping into a low, resonant frequency that filled the small enclosure like in physical presence. "That's the door handle from Elm Street. In July 2005, you thought you were careful. You wore gloves when you walked into her kitchen. You didn't leave a single fingerprint on the counter. You didn't leave a drop of blood on the hardwood floors. You thought you were a ghost, a professional moving through a safe neighborhood who could take a human life and dissolve into the background noise of the city without leaving a whisper behind. But you forgot one thing. You forgot that when you pulled that front door shut to lock her inside your van, your glove tore. Just a fraction of an inch, Arthur. A microscopic split in the latex that allowed a handful of your skin cells to transfer onto that chrome." Pendleton's jaw tightened, a small muscle twitching beneath the silver stubble of his cheek. He slowly raised his head, his eyes locking with Lynn's gaze with a hardened, defensive hostility that betrayed the raw calculation of a survivor. "I don't know anything about a schoolteacher," he said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that sounded like dry stone grinding against stone. "I was a delivery driver 20 years ago. I drove all over the state. I touched thousands of doors. If my DNA is on a handle, it's because I was dropping off a package. It's a mistake. You've got the wrong man. You can't destroy my life, my family's life, based on a piece of trash science from 20 years ago." "The science isn't trash, Arthur, and it doesn't make mistakes," Lynn countered instantly, leaning forward until she was entirely within his personal space, her expression an immovable wall of professional neutrality. "A delivery driver doesn't leave their DNA embedded in a deep friction deposit on the inside latch of a locked house without an active confrontation. And a delivery driver doesn't clear their GPS routing logs from July 2005 and hide the backup drives behind a false wall in their basement workshop unless they are guarding a grave. We have the transponder data from your van. We know you were at the house for 11 minutes, and we know you drove straight to the Meadowlands Bypass Foundation right after. The circle is completely closed, Arthur. The house of cards you spent 21 years building has collapsed. The only question left is how much of the wreckage you want to drop onto your daughter's shoulders." The mention of his family was the definitive blow that fractured his composure. Pendleton's weight shifted backward in his chair, a long, trembling exhale escaping his lungs as his eyes darted to the two-way mirror on the wall, realizing that the entire weight of the federal justice system was watching his reality dissolve into nothingness. The grandfatherly persona, the respectability, the domestic peace he had meticulously cultivated in his suburban development were completely gone, stripped away by the unyielding precision of the data science that had tracked him across decades of human shifting. Outside the interrogation block, the media embargo was beginning to rupture with the force of an explosion. Word had leaked to the Federal Press Corps that a massive, historical break had occurred in the 2005 case, and the plaza outside One Police Plaza was rapidly filling with live broadcast vans, satellite trucks, and investigative journalists demanding a formal statement from the department's public information officer. The news banners were already flashing across the networks. Notorious cold case shattered. Midnight raid ends 21-year mystery. The collective consciousness of the valley was waking up to a reality that felt entirely impossible. The quiet logistics coordinator who managed their regional shipping lines was a monster who had hidden an atrocity in the very foundations of the city they traveled every single day. But inside the war room, Vance was already focused on the logistics of the recovery. He was on the phone with structural engineers from the New York Department of Transportation, his hand tracing the contours of the 2005 construction blueprints spread across the table. They were mapping the exact location of the concrete pier supports that corresponded to the GPS coordinates extracted from Pendleton's hard drive. It was a terrifyingly complex engineering problem. The site was now a high-velocity transport hub, covered by 4 lanes of asphalt and tons of reinforced steel structural pillars that carried thousands of vehicles an hour. To excavate the remains would require a surgical, subterranean operation that would test the limits of forensic recovery and engineering precision, a physical manifestation of the immense difficulty of dragging a 40-year-old truth out of the dark. "We will have to go through the auxiliary drainage vault," the lead engineer explained, his finger pointing to a narrow, concrete access shaft that ran beneath the southern support column of the bypass. The GPS coordinates put the van directly over Pier 4. If he deposited the body into the open trench before the primary pour, the remains will be encased at the base of the foundation, roughly 12 feet beneath the active roadway level. "We can't cut the pillar without compromising the bridge structure. We will have to excavate horizontally from the access vault, using specialized concrete diamond saws and sonic imaging to isolate the cavity without causing a structural failure." The execution of the recovery plan was authorized under an emergency federal warrant by 4 a.m. on Wednesday morning. A convoy of forensic units, heavy utility vehicles, and structural containment teams moved out from the city under total radio silence, their amber warning lights flashing against the foggy expanses of the Meadowlands as they established a secure perimeter around the Route 7 access vault. The site was completely cordoned off behind heavy black tarpaulins, transforming a busy transit artery into a sterile, high-security cathedral of forensic exploration. The contrast was profoundly macabre. Thousands of motorists were speeding across the bridge above, their engines vibrating through the steel structure, entirely unaware that a team of scientists was dropping into the dark earth beneath them to extract the final, devastating proof of a 21-year-old murder. Lynn stood at the entrance of the drainage vault, her breathing punctuated by the cool, damp air rising from the subterranean concrete shaft. The air smelled of sulfur, stagnant water, and the sharp, industrial tang of wet asphalt. Beside her stood the recovery team, their faces pale under the harsh glare of halogen construction lamps as they prepared their equipment. Sonic scanners, pneumatic drills, and soft bristle brushes that would be used to meticulously peel back the layers of earth and concrete that had acted as a secret vault since the summer of 2005. They weren't just fighting the physical hardness of the material, they were fighting against the institutional amnesia of a city that builds over its tragedies, a city that shifts its topography so rapidly that the sins of the past are constantly being buried beneath the progress of the present. The sonic scanner began its slow, methodical sweep against the rough face of the concrete foundation wall inside the vault, the digital display translating the structural anomalies into ribbons of high-resolution pixel data. For 3 hours, the only sound breaking the subterranean quiet was the low hum of the portable generator and the muffled roar of the traffic passing on the lanes above. Then, the monitor flared, a distinct, irregular void appearing exactly at the base of Pier 4, a structural disruption in the uniform density of the 2005 industrial pour that matched the dimensions of a human form. "We have an anomaly," the structural technician murmured, his hand adjusting the frequency dial on the scanner. "The density drops significantly within this specific 4-foot perimeter. The concrete didn't seal uniformly here. There's an inclusion, organic material that prevented the aggregate from bonding with the steel rebar." The SAW team moved into position, their diamond-tipped blades throwing a thick spray of gray water and fine concrete dust into the enclosed space as they began the agonizingly slow process of slicing through the outer layer of the foundation. The noise was a deafening, mechanical scream that echoed off the damp walls of the vault, a sound that felt like the structural reality of the city itself resisting the exposure of its secrets. Lynn watched the blade sink deeper into the reinforced concrete, her mind projecting the image of Thomas Vance sitting at his desk for 21 years, staring at the empty living room photos while the white van was parked over this trench, letting the concrete aggregate settle over the evidence of his failure. As the final perimeter cut was completed, a massive block of the foundation wall was carefully hoisted out using a hydraulic winch, revealing a dark, tightly packed pocket of industrial silt and degraded insulation material that had been trapped inside the pour since 2005. The SAW team stepped back, their job finished, leaving the space to the forensic anthropologists who dropped to their knees with small hand trowels and soft brushes, their movements reverent and precise. The air inside the vault grew suddenly heavier, an oppressive, suffocating stillness descending upon the space as the first layer of dark silt was gently brushed away from the cavity. Deep within the dark pocket, beneath the compressed debris of 2 decades of urban shifting, the trowel of an assistant struck something solid, a fragment of material that was distinct from the surrounding aggregate. Lynn felt a sudden chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the drainage shaft. The search was transitioning from a data problem into a material reality. The ground was finally giving up its dead, the unyielding precision of a technology had provided the map, and the Earth was surrendering the final, devastating witness that would drag Arthur Pendleton out of his suburban camouflage and lock him into the permanent darkness of a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. The horizontal drill team operated with a tense, low-vibrational rhythm that shook the concrete floor of the drainage vault, their movements carefully calibrated to avoid fracturing the structural load-bearing capacity of Pier 4. Inside the subterranean chamber, the air had turned into a thick, swirling slurry of gray masonry dust, pulverized quartz, and cooling water that pooled around the boots of the forensic technicians. Every square inch of the excavation zone was treated with an intense, militaristic rigor, mapped out onto a high-definition digital grid that synchronized the physical cavity with the 3-dimensional LiDAR scans generated by the Task Force's engineering division. They were no longer merely processing a crime scene. They were cutting through the literal infrastructure of the city to extract a truth that had been locked away in a synthetic tomb since the searing heat of July 2005. Detective Sarah Lynn stood at the threshold of the breach, her protective goggles covered in a fine layer of concrete silt, her focus anchored onto the small hand tools line up on the sterile steel equipment trays. Beside her, Detective Thomas Vance watched the drilling process in absolute immobility, his breathing shallow and deliberate through his respirator mask. For 21 years, Vance had carried the memory of the empty kitchen on Elm Street as an unpayable debt, a personal failure that had aged him more thoroughly than the simple passage of the calendar. Now, as the hydraulic winch groaned under the weight of the secondary concrete block being pried away from the foundation core, he could feel the immense, suffocating weight of that old mystery finally beginning to break apart. The pneumatic chisels were brought to a sudden halt on a sharp, verbal directive from Dr. Elena Vance, the lead forensic anthropologist assigned to the Federal Recovery Unit. She dropped to her knees onto a specialized foam pad, her gloved fingers picking up a small fiber-optic scope and feeding it directly into a narrow, dark fissure that had opened between the reinforced steel rebar and the original 2005 aggregate pour. The monitor attached to the scope flared to life, displaying a low-resolution video feed of a hollow, insulated pocket within the concrete, a space where the structural material had failed to bond correctly due to the presence of an organic obstruction. The structural integrity of the pocket is stable, Dr. Vance announced, her voice flat, clinical, and completely level through the intercom system. The aggregate didn't crush the interior cavity because the subject was deposited within a heavy canvas equipment bag that absorbed the initial pressure of the wet pour. We're looking at a highly preserved microenvironment. The moisture levels have been completely stabilized by the surrounding concrete shell for 21 years. Bring in the manual scrapers and the fine mesh screens. We are entering the recovery phase. The tactical transition from heavy industrial engineering to delicate archaeological extraction changed the entire atmosphere of the vault. The roaring engines of the saws and drills were shut down, leaving the space in a sudden, ringing silence that was punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thudding of thousands of vehicles passing over the highway bridge lanes directly above their heads. The motorists were moving toward Manhattan at 80 miles an hour, their daily routines entirely uninterrupted by the fact that 12 feet beneath their tires, the state was meticulously unpacking the dark remnants of a notorious atrocity that had paralyzed their community for a generation. Lynn moved into the well of the excavation alongside Dr. Vance, using a small plastic trowel to gently dislodge the compacted layers of industrial silt and dried chemical sealant that had settled over the mouth of the canvas enclosure. Every handful of material was deposited into labeled plastic bins, passed down a human chain to the screening station at the mouth of the vault where 2 analysts sifted the debris through ultrafine wire mesh to isolate hair follicles, synthetic clothing fibers, or personal artifacts that could provide an immediate biological correlation. The precision was absolute, a methodical, step-by-step unspooling of a timeline that Arthur Pendleton had spent more than half his adult life trying to erase from the ledger of human memory. Deep within the dark recess of the concrete pier, the plastic edge of Lynn's trowel caught on a rigid, unyielding surface that was distinct from the surrounding limestone aggregate. She stopped, using a soft bristled brush to clear away the fine gray powder that covered the object, revealing a strip of deteriorated blue fabric, the unmistakable strap of a heavy nylon backpack that the schoolteacher had been using to carry her summer reading materials on the afternoon she vanished from her home. The fabric was stiff, the chemical dyes faded by the alkaline properties of the concrete, but its physical structure was perfectly intact, a material anchor connecting the subterranean darkness of the Meadowlands to the bright, ordinary reality of July 2005. "We have visual confirmation on the personal effects," Lynn said, her voice steady but carrying an underlying sharpness that caused the analysts in the observation room to lean toward their tracking monitors. "The backpack strap is consistent with the inventory list compiled during the 2005 neighborhood canvass. I am moving the excavation perimeter 2 inches north to expose the primary skeletal alignment." As the brushes moved across the cavity, the true horror of Pendleton's calculation was laid bare to the silent assembly of investigators. The victim had been deposited into the open foundation trench with her arms crossed over her chest, her position indicating a rapid, forceful concealment executed during the brief interval between the departure of the morning grading crews and the arrival of the afternoon cement transit mixers. The alkaline environment of the industrial pore had acted as a unique preservative agent, desiccating the organic remains and preventing the typical bacterial breakdown that occurs in a standard soil burial. The skeletal structure was pristine, a pale, unyielding monument to a life cut short, its physical configuration holding the exact trauma signatures of her final struggle against her abductor. Dr. Vance adjusted her overhead lamp, the high-intensity white light illuminating the cranial structure of the remains. "We have immediate trauma indicators on the left parietal bone," she noted, pointing with a sterile plastic probe to a distinct, star-shaped fracture pattern that had shattered the protective curvature of the skull. "The injury is a classic depressed fracture caused by a dynamic, high-velocity impact from a blunt instrument featuring a defined, angular edge. The bone density reaction confirms that this trauma was sustained per mortem at the exact time of death and was catastrophic in nature. It is entirely consistent with the dimensions of a heavy industrial tire iron or the mechanical latching tool of a commercial delivery van." The forensic confirmation was the final, devastating piece of the prosecution's structural jigsaw puzzle. The data extracted from Pendleton's encrypted hard drives, the satellite telemetry logs that placed his Ford Econoline van at the Elm Street house for 11 minutes and at Pier 4 for 44 minutes, was no longer just an abstract sequence of coordinates on a prosecutor's screen. It was now a physical reality, a material timeline verified by the bone, the fabric, and the concrete of the city itself. The Phantom had been stripped of his defensive geometry. His survival strategy had been exposed as a pathetic, cowardly exercise in urban camouflage that had been thoroughly dismantled by the relentless, multi-generational persistence of the task force. By 8 a.m. on Thursday morning, the recovery phase was concluded. The remains and the associated artifacts were secured inside climate-controlled transport cases, sealed with federal evidence tape, and hoisted out of the drainage vault using a heavy-duty municipal crane. Lynn stepped out of the tarpaulin enclosure onto the service shoulder of Route 7, the bright morning sun blinding her for a moment after the hours of claustrophobic darkness within the shaft. The air outside was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of the nearby salt marshes and the exhaust fumes of the morning rush hour traffic that was already beginning to back up along the bypass lanes. The media presence at the perimeter was immense, a literal wall of television satellite trucks, mobile broadcast units, and shouting journalists who were being held back by a double line of state police barricades. The news of the excavation had leaked to the local networks hours earlier, and the entire metropolitan area was currently locked in a state of collective, shuddering fascination as the images of the medical examiner's vehicle moving out from under the bridge were broadcast live across the country. The search terms "justice delayed" and "midnight raid" were dominating every digital platform, and public recognition that a 21-year-old wrong was finally, through the power of data science and human endurance, being forced into a definitive legal reckoning. Lynn didn't look at the cameras as she walked toward her sedan. She opened the door, slipped her respirator mask off her face, and sat in the quiet sanctuary of the front seat, her body aching with exhaustion that felt older than the case itself. She looked across the console at Thomas Vance, who was staring out the passenger window at the flashing blue lights of the cruisers blocking the intersection. The old detective looked different now, the hard, frantic tension that had defined his expressions for 2 decades appearing to dissolve under the pale morning light, leaving behind only the simple, quiet reality of a man who had finally finished his job. "We did it, Tom," Lynn said quietly, her hand resting on the steering wheel. "She's out of the concrete. The lab has the skull trauma, and the DA has the GPS overlays. There is nowhere left for Arthur Pendleton to hide." Vance let out a long, slow breath that sounded like a sigh of pure, physical release, his eyes tracking the movement of the clouds over the marshlands. "He had 21 years, Sarah," Vance whispered, his voice cracking slightly with an emotion he had kept bottled up since the summer of 2005. 21 years of barbecues, family dinners, and quiet nights on his porch while she was under that pillar. He thought he outrun us. He thought because the city kept building, because the roads got wider and the buildings got bigger, that the world would just let him keep his secret. But the ground doesn't lie. And the science doesn't forget. The administrative focus of the task force shifted instantly from the marshlands to the secure corridors of the federal courthouse on Pearl Street, where a special grand jury was being convened on Friday morning to review the newly recovered physical evidence. The assistant district attorney was moving for a multi-count indictment of first-degree kidnapping and second-degree murder, charges that carried a mandatory maximum penalty of life, without the possibility of parole under the federal statutes governing crimes committed during interstate commerce activities. The legal track was clear, the architecture was unassailable, and the monster of Elm Street was firmly locked in a high-security holding cell, waiting for the definitive, thunderous roar of a system that had finally, after the longest and most agonizing of winters, caught up to his crimes. The dawn that broke over Foley Square on the morning of the grand jury presentation was heavy with the suffocating humidity of a New York summer, a thick mist clinging to the granite columns of the federal courthouse like a shroud. Inside the war room on the 8th floor of One Police Plaza, the transition from physical excavation to legal mobilization had been executed with the fluid, militaristic precision of a task force that knew the enemy was already backed into a corner. Detective Sarah Lynn sat before a twin array of high-definition monitors, her fingers flying across the interface as she locked the final data packets into the master presentation grid. Beside her, Assistant District Attorney Catherine Blake reviewed the indictment sheets, her expression a mask of cold, calculating intellect that had dismantled some of the most sophisticated criminal syndicates in the tri-state area. They weren't just preparing a standard prosecutorial narrative. They were assembling a digital and material fortress designed to withstand the immediate, aggressive onslaught of Arthur Pendleton's newly retained legal representation. The defense team, an elite cohort of high-priced white-collar litigators financed by the liquidation of Pendleton's logistics company shares, had already filed a series of emergency motions aimed at halting the grand jury proceedings. They were going to attack the validity of the genetic database search. They were going to question the chain of custody for the 30-year-old door handle, and they were going to paint the midnight raid as a calculated piece of theatrical government overreach designed to extract a coerced confession from an elderly, disoriented suspect. But Blake didn't rattle easily. She knew that the true strength of the state's position lay in the absolute, empirical alignment of the physical evidence. On the desk between the investigators sat 3 large, vacuum-sealed evidence containers holding the newly recovered artifacts from Pier 4, the deteriorated blue nylon backpack strap, the microenvironment dirt samples from the core cavity, and the high-resolution digital rendering of the star-shaped cranial trauma signatures mapped by Dr. Elena Vance. This wasn't circumstantial deduction. It was a physical timeline written into the literal infrastructure of the city, a material ledger that Pendleton could neither delete nor deny. At 9:30 a.m., the heavy oak doors of the grand jury room swung shut, isolating 23 ordinary citizens from the frantic noise of the press corps that packed the marble corridors outside. The air inside the chamber was cold, smelling of stale paper, institutional air conditioning, and the distinct, low-frequency tension that accompanies a historical reckoning. Lynn took her place at the witness stand, her uniform immaculate, her demeanor reflecting the objective, clinical detachment of a scientist delivering a lecture on data anomalies rather than a detective detailing a horrific abduction. She did not start with emotional rhetoric. She let the coordinates do the talking. Using a specialized mapping interface, Lynn projected the historical satellite telemetry data onto the screen above the jury box. The red lines of the 2005 tracking logs moved across the digital grid of the valley with the rhythmic, uncaring certainty of an industrial machine. The jurors watched in absolute stillness as the digital avatar of the white Ford Econoline van accelerated away from the shipping depot, navigated the residential avenues of the suburbs, and came to a dead stop at the Elm Street house at exactly 1:42 p.m. on that blistering July afternoon. The vehicle remained stationary at this location for precisely 11 minutes, Lynn stated, her voice level, resonant, and entirely devoid of hesitation. During this brief window, the victim's phone went dark, the front door latch was violently breached, and her personal effects were loaded into the cargo bay. The suspect did not follow a standard commercial delivery route after this interception. As you can see from the subsequent tracking path, he accelerated directly toward the restricted construction zone of the Route 7 logistics bypass. She tapped the screen, zooming in on the 3-dimensional rendering of Pier 4. At 2:15 p.m., the transponder records the vehicle entering the subterranean grading trench. It remains stationary for 44 minutes, the exact interval required to deposit the canvas enclosure into the open foundation cavity before the afternoon cement transit mixers initiated the primary industrial concrete pour. For 21 years, this physical coordination remained hidden beneath 4 lanes of high-velocity transit asphalt, protected by the very growth of the metropolitan infrastructure. But the data did not dissolve, and the concrete did not alter the alignment of the base pairs. The presentation of the forensic anthropology report was the moment the internal atmosphere of the grand jury room shifted from analytical observation to a profound, collective shock. Lynn displayed the high-magnification digital scans of the victim's cranial structure, pointing with a sterile laser indicator to the distinct, depressed fracture lines on the left parietal bone. The raw, mechanical reality of the impact, the star-shaped indentation that proved the violence had been delivered from behind with immense velocity using a heavy, angular iron tool, was unassailable. The jurors leaned forward, some covering their mouths, their eyes darting from the clinical graphics on the screen to the stark, typed confession sheets that sat on the prosecutor's table. Behind the two-way mirror of the observation alcove, Thomas Vance watched the jurors' reactions with a quiet, exhausted validation. He had spent more than 2 decades being told by successive police administrations that he was chasing a ghost, that his obsession with the 2005 file was a symptom of professional burnout, and that the schoolteacher had likely fled the country or fallen victim to a transient predator who was long dead. Now, The unyielding precision of modern science had vindicated his instinct, turning his old notebooks into the foundation of an absolute legal execution. The grand jury didn't waste time with semantic debates or extended structural deliberations. Within 35 minutes of Blake wrapping up the state's oral presentation, the foreman emerged from the chamber to hand down a true bill, indicting Arthur Pendleton on charges of first-degree kidnapping, first-degree felony murder, and second-degree intentional murder. It was a clean sweep for the prosecution, a total structural victory that stripped the defense of their early leverage and locked the monster of Elm Street into a direct, unavoidable trajectory toward a capital trial in the federal district court. The public announcement of the indictment hit the city with the force of a tectonic tremor. By noon, the name Arthur Pendleton was flashing across every digital news terminal and television monitor in the country, his booking photograph, a stark, uncompromising image of a silver-haired, vacant-eyed 54-year-old logistics manager stripped of his civilian identity, becoming the defining symbol of a shattered illusion. The shockwave was particularly devastating in the quiet suburban development where Pendleton had spent the last 2 decades masquerading as a pillar of middle-class dependability. In the neighborhood of his split-level home, the silence that followed the indictment was heavy, paranoid, and thick with an underlying revulsion. Neighbors who had shared lawn equipment with Pendleton, who had watched him smoke meat on his backyard grill during summer block parties, and who had trusted him to watch their homes during winter vacations found themselves looking at their own door latches with a sudden, visceral terror. The intimacy of his integration into their daily landscape was the true horror. He hadn't spent his unearned freedom hiding in the margins of society or the dangerous corners of a foreign underworld. He had stayed right next to them, wearing the mask of an ordinary, dependable father and grandfather, all while carrying the memory of the concrete trench in the meadowlands close to his chest like a prized possession. The physical arena of his domestic life was now a permanent extension of a federal crime scene. Unmarked police vans and forensic transport utility trucks remained parked along the curb of the dead-end street, their amber warning lights casting a rhythmic pulse against the drawn curtains of the neighboring houses. Inside Pendleton's basement workshop, tactical search teams equipped with ground-penetrating radar and chemical enhancement sprays continued their meticulous extraction of his past. They weren't just looking for evidence from 2005. They were searching for trophies, small, hidden tokens, or personal items taken from the victim that predators of his profile so often preserve to fuel their psychological survival across decades of normalcy. Deep within a hidden storage alcove beneath his heavy industrial workbench, the radar units flagged a distinct structural anomaly in the concrete foundation wall, a small, hollow space that did not align with the original architectural blueprints of the house. Lynn was called back to the scene, her boots crunching against the sawdust and dried wood glue that covered the basement floor as she descended into the cramped, subterranean workspace. The containment team utilized a specialized sonic drill to create a narrow access point, feeding a flexible fiber-optic camera into the darkness of the wall cavity. The monitor flared to life, displaying a small, velvet-lined metal strongbox wrapped in layers of heavy industrial plastic to protect it from the moisture of the subterranean earth. The retrieval was executed with extreme forensic caution, the container placed onto a sterile tray before the seals were carefully snipped away under the glare of tactical floodlights. When the lid of the box was lifted, the room went completely cold, a silent, heavy stillness descending upon the technicians as the contents were revealed to the light. Resting inside the velvet tray was a single, laminated library catalog card from the municipal library, dated July 12, 2005, bearing the handwritten initials of the missing schoolteacher, a mundane piece of administrative paper that she had used to organize her summer reading programs on the morning she was violently erased from the earth. Beside the card lay a small silver charm bracelet, its links tarnished by 21 years of dark confinement, but its structure intact, holding 3 small charms: a book, a graduation cap, and a miniature schoolhouse. It was the ultimate trophy, a material validation of his malice that completely demolished any remaining defense theory of a tragic, panic-induced accident or a case of mistaken identity. He had kept her life locked in his wall while he built his own. The discovery of the strongbox was the definitive hammer blow that broke the spirit of the defense's appellate strategy. Richard Sterling, the lead defense counsel, sat in his high-rise office overlooking Foley Square, looking at the newly updated evidence manifests with the hollow expression of a litigator who knew the game was completely over. There were no constitutional loopholes left to exploit, no procedural delays that could survive the double weight of the GPS transponder data and the discovery of the victim's personal jewelry hidden inside the suspect's own foundation. The perimeter had shrunk to the point of absolute suffocation. By Thursday afternoon, a secret, high-priority request for a judicial conference was submitted to the presiding federal judge by the defense team. They weren't fighting for an acquittal anymore. They were begging for a plea agreement that would remove the mandatory maximum penalty of life without the possibility of parole in exchange for a full, unredacted allocation of the facts and the permanent forfeiture of all his logistical assets to the victim's family foundation. Arthur Pendleton wanted to negotiate for the survival of his remaining years, a pathetic, cowardly bid for comfort from a man who had denied his victim even the dignity of a proper grave for 21 years. But Blake refused to entertain any mitigation of the charges. She stood in the judge's private chambers, her posture rigid, her voice carrying a cold, uncompromising finality that left no room for legal compromise. "The state will not negotiate with a phantom, Your Honor," Blake stated, her eyes locking with the defense counsel's. "We have the DNA from the door handle, we have the satellite tracks from the van, we have the skull trauma from the foundation, and we have her bracelet from his basement wall. He didn't offer her a deal on Elm Street in 2005, and we will not offer him a deal in this courthouse in 2026. We are going to trial. We're going to present every ugly, calculated detail of this atrocity to the public, and we're going to let the jury lock him into a concrete cell for the rest of his natural life until he rots into the same nothingness he tried to inflict on this community." Lynn walked out of the federal complex into the blazing heat of the late afternoon, the heavy, humid air hitting her face like a physical barrier as she navigated the crowded sidewalks of Lower Manhattan. The news of the hidden strongbox had already leaked to the digital networks, the banners flashing across the massive screens in Times Square, a public confirmation that the mystery that had haunted the valley for a generation was finally, completely, and permanently resolved. The hunt was over. The forensic science had provided the unassailable key, and the ghost of Elm Street had run out of runway. As she looked back through the granite columns of the courthouse, she knew that the distance between the crime and the punishment had finally been reduced to zero, leaving behind only the thunderous, inevitable march of a system that would ensure the truth would have the absolute, final, and everlasting word. The crushing weight of the newly discovered trophy box beneath Arthur Pendleton's industrial workbench acted as the final, absolute anchor that dragged the defense team down into the depths of a legal surrender. By the time the sweltering heat of mid-July began to bake the asphalt of Lower Manhattan, the theatrical bravado of Richard Sterling had evaporated into the sterile air of the federal courthouse on Pearl Street. The state's case was no longer a collection of speculative theories or circumstantial deductions. It had become an industrial press, a seamless matrix of genetic sequencing, satellite telemetry, and physical trophies that left the defendant exposed to the absolute velocity of federal prosecution. Inside Interrogation Room C, the climate remained locked in a freezing, clinical stasis that seemed entirely detached from the summer humidity vibrating outside the thick concrete walls. Vincent Moretti, now stripped of his civilian identity and known exclusively to the system as Federal Inmate 88419, sat with his silver hair unkempt, his shoulders slumping forward until his chest nearly touched the stainless steel surface of the table. The soft cream cardigan he had worn during his initial appearances had been replaced by the uniform, institutional orange canvas of the Metropolitan Detention Facility, a visual stripping of his domestic camouflage that mirrored the total destruction of his legal defense. Detective Sarah Lynn took her seat opposite him, her movements calculated, slow, and entirely devoid of the frantic energy that had characterized the early hours of the midnight raid. She unclasped a heavy, black leather presentation binder, its surface bearing the official gold seal of the Department of Justice, and began sliding the high-resolution photographs of the hidden basement alcove across the metal table. One by one, The images documented the excavation of his secret workshop, the sonic drill bits penetrating the foundation wall, the prying open of the concrete cavity, and finally, the pristine, unretouched close-up of the velvet-lined strongbox holding the laminated library catalog card and the small silver charm bracelet. The room hung in a suffocating stillness, the only sound the low, mechanical hum of the digital recording equipment embedded in the ceiling panels. "It's over, Arthur," Lynn said, her voice dropping into a quiet, low-frequency register that carried the unyielding weight of an absolute truth. "You can't run the GPS alibi anymore. You can't tell a jury that your DNA was left on that door latch by a passing delivery error. You kept her life locked inside your foundation wall for 21 years. You built your home, you raised your children, and you slept every night directly above the physical token of her erasure. That isn't panic, Arthur. That isn't a tragic accident that went wrong in the dark of a summer afternoon. That is the cold, calculated validation of a predator who wanted to keep a piece of his violence alive while he hid in the baseline noise of this city." Pendleton didn't raise his head, his cuffed hands trembling with a sudden, violent tremor that caused the heavy iron chain linked to the floor bolt to rattle against the steel table legs. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lungs, a sound that carried the total, exhausted collapse of a man who had successfully navigated the margins of a brutal city for more than 2 decades and had finally run completely out of options. The grandfatherly mask, the respectability, the carefully cultivated image of suburban dependability had been thoroughly pulverized by the material reality of the artifacts sitting before him. "I wanted to throw it away," Pendleton whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like dry stone grinding against stone in an empty valley. 100 times, I took that box out of the wall and drove down to the river, intending to drop it into the deep current where no one would ever see it again. But I couldn't do it. Every time I held that silver bracelet in my hand, it was the only thing that made the past feel real. The rest of my life, the shipping firm, the house, the barbecues, the family dinners, it felt like a script I was reading, a play I was performing to keep the world from looking too closely at the basement. The box was the only place where I didn't have to wear the mask." The admission, spoken with a flat, unrepentant psychological clarity, sent an immediate chill through the observation deck where Detective Thomas Vance stood with his hands flat against the two-way glass. Vance didn't blink, his eyes tracking the minute shifts in the suspect's posture as the final walls of the 2005 mystery were methodically dismantled. He had waited 21 years for this specific afternoon, surviving the bureaucratic neglect of successive administrations and the quiet, patronizing pity of colleagues who believed he was chasing a phantom born of his own professional burnout. Now, the phantom was a documented criminal, his confession being etched into an unassailable digital record that would outlast them all. Outside the courthouse walls, the administrative fallout from the grand jury's true bill was executing a profound, permanent transformation across the metropolitan landscape. In the quiet suburban development where Pendleton had anchored his domestic life, the property values were experiencing a sudden, catastrophic collapse as the reality of his exposure settled into the soil of the neighborhood. The split-level home on the dead-end street had become a dark landmark, a modern house of horrors that drew caravan lines of morbid onlookers who drove slowly past the manicured lawn, their cell phone cameras flashing against the drawn curtains where forensic teams were still executing their secondary search warrants. The neighbors who had spent 2 decades waving to Pendleton across the hedges, who had trusted him to watch their children during summer block parties, and who had sat next to him at the local sports bars during football season found themselves trapped in a state of hypervigilant paranoia. They were tearing down their own garage storage spaces, rekeying their locks, and analyzing every historical interaction with the logistics manager through a lens of profound revulsion. The horror wasn't that a monster had invaded their safe community from the outside. The horror was that the monster had been an exemplary participant in the construction of that safety, an architect of their normalcy who had used the very predictability of their suburban life to camouflage an abomination. By Friday afternoon, the district attorney's public information officer stepped up to the podium in the main briefing room of Foley Square, her face illuminated by the blinding glare of dozens of television camera lights. The room was packed to its structural capacity with international journalists, investigative legal analysts, and true crime broadcasters who had spent weeks converting the 2005 file into primetime content for millions of consumers across the globe. But the statement delivered was short, clinical, and completely stripped of promotional theater. The United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, in coordination with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the State Police Task Force, has finalized the multi-count indictment against Arthur Pendleton, the officer announced, her voice level and flat against the shouting of the gallery. In light of the unassailable physical evidence recovered from the target's residence, including the personal effects of the victim hidden within a structural alcove, the defense has explicitly waived their right to a public trial. A formal plea agreement has been executed in federal chambers. Arthur Pendleton has entered a plea of guilty to 1 count of first-degree kidnapping resulting in death and 1 count of second-degree intentional murder. Under the statutory mandates of the Federal Penal Code, he has been sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served immediately within a maximum security federal penitentiary. The announcement struck the press room like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. There would be no marathon trial, no weeks of technical cross-examinations regarding DNA methodology, and no public performance of character mitigation by high-priced defense lawyers. The forensic science had been so precise, the alignment of the data so total, that the defense had chosen to capitulate in the dark rather than face the total, public exposure of a trial that would have destroyed the remaining sanity of Pendleton's surviving family. It was a clinical execution of justice, an absolute closing of the account that left the suspect with nothing but a permanent cell number and the realization that his 30-year run of unearned safety had ended in absolute defeat. For Sarah Lynn, walking out of the federal complex into the blinding, humid glare of the late afternoon plaza, the conclusion brought no explosion of triumph, only a heavy, systemic fatigue that felt as old as the city itself. She spent her final hours on the active case file in her office at One Police Plaza, boxing up the historical logbooks, the digital transponder maps, and the typed notes that Vance had kept in his desk drawer since the summer of 2005. She watched the traffic crawl down Broadway, the sirens of a distant ambulance echoing off the glass facades of the high-rises, a visual reminder that the city would continue its frantic, chaotic expansion without ever acknowledging the singular tragedy that had been resolved beneath its foundations. New York would keep building, the roads would get wider, the concrete pillars of the Meadowlands bypass would continue to carry thousands of vehicles an hour, and the organic boutiques of the Upper West Side would keep selling their goods to residents who knew nothing of the phantoms that once moved through their alleys. But the file was closed. The 2005 cold case, the mystery that had been a synonym for futility and community trauma for 21 years, had been definitively shattered by the unyielding persistence of human will and the miracle of modern data science. The 19-year-old schoolteacher was no longer a missing persons flyer fading on a precinct bulletin board. She had been restored to the ledger of the living, her name cleared of the silence, her memory rescued from the concrete, and her family finally, at long last, granted the simple, quiet, and unburdened right to look toward the future without the fear of the ghost that had haunted them for so long. The administrative finality of the federal plea agreement did not instantly dissolve the heavy, lingering fog of paranoia that had gripped the valley for over 2 decades. In the weeks following Arthur Pendleton's formal relocation to the maximum security penitentiary in Florence, Colorado, the task force found itself facing a secondary, deeply meticulous phase of operations, the total forensic closure of the 2005 case file. Detective Sarah Lynn sat alone in the quiet sanctuary of the Special Victims Bureau, her desk illuminated by the pale blue glare of a dual-monitor setup that displayed the final, archived logs of the investigation. Every digital folder had to be encrypted, every physical artifact cataloged for permanent evidence storage, and every cross-reference double-checked to ensure that no technical loopholes remained open for future legal challenges. The physical files, which had once occupied 3 entire steel cabinets in the precinct's active homicide division, were now contained within a single, high-capacity external server drive, a digital distillation of 21 years of human agony, systemic frustration, and eventual scientific triumph. Lynn clicked through the scanned images of the original 2005 neighborhood canvas, her eyes tracing the names of witnesses who had since passed away, businesses that had gone bankrupt, and streets that had been completely reshaped by the city's relentless infrastructure boom. The data was cold, mathematical, and completely indifferent to the emotional devastation it represented. It stood as a permanent testament to the fact that while human memory is a fragile, easily distorted medium, the material reality of a crime leaves an indelible footprint that time cannot wash away. Outside the precinct walls, the public consciousness was undergoing a slow, painful process of structural recalibration. The national news cameras had folded their satellite dishes and moved on to newer, more immediate acts of violence, but the community of Elm Street remained deeply marked by the exposure of the monster who had lived in their margins. The young couple who had purchased Pendleton's former split-level home had initiated a complete structural renovation of the property, a desperate attempt to sanitize the domestic space from the toxic legacy of its previous owner. Heavy machinery tore up the manicured lawn where Pendleton had once hosted neighborhood barbecues and the concrete floor of the basement workshop, where the velvet-lined trophy box had been extracted from the foundation wall, was completely broken apart and hauled away in industrial dumpsters. The neighborhood was attempting to rebuild its shattered sense of security, but the intimacy of Pendleton's integration into their lives left behind a permanent layer of hypervigilant anxiety. People found themselves looking at their delivery drivers, their mail carriers, and their utility contractors through a lens of profound suspicion, suddenly aware that the ordinary infrastructure of their daily routine could be weaponized by a predator with a calculated camouflage strategy. The caretakers of the local municipal library, where the schoolteacher had organized her final summer reading program on that fateful July afternoon, had installed a permanent bronze memorial plaque near the entrance, a quiet, dignified monument that ensured her contribution to the community would outlast the memory of the violence that had stolen her future. For Detective Thomas Vance, the post-plea reality was a period of profound, unaccustomed stillness. He had officially surrendered his active credentials the day after the sentencing, stepping out of one police plaza as a retired civilian for the first time in his adult life. He spent his mornings walking along the rocky shoreline of the Hudson River, his breathing no longer punctuated by the frantic adrenaline of an unsolved obsession, his eyes no longer scanning the crowds for a face that matched the blurry composite sketches from 2005. The toxic guilt that had hollowed out his career had finally burned away, replaced by the deep, quiet validation of an investigator who had seen his ground-level instincts fully vindicated by the unyielding precision of modern genomic science. Vance met Lynn one final time at a small diner near Foley Square, the very establishment where they had spent dozens of late nights dissecting the routing logs and the satellite telemetry sheets during the high-voltage phase of the investigation. The diner was crowded with lunchtime commuters, the air thick with the scent of coffee, fried onions, and the constant, ambient roar of the city outside the glass windows. They sat in a corner booth, a single manila envelope sitting between them on the laminated tabletop, the final, official notification of case closure signed by the United States Attorney. "You look different, Tom," Lynn said quietly, watching the old detective as he poured sugar into his mug. "The weight's gone." Vance let out a long, slow breath, a faint smile breaking through the deeply etched lines of his weathered face. "It's the first time in 21 years I haven't woken up at 3 a.m. thinking about that kitchen counter, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping into a soft, gravelly frequency that was entirely at peace. "For 2 decades, I felt like I was locked in a room with a ghost, arguing with an empty chair because nobody else could see what I was looking for. But the science opened the door. You and that lab team gave that girl her voice back, and you put the monster in a cage where he belongs. The account is settled." He pushed the manila envelope across the table toward her. "Keep the server keys secure, kid. There are still thousands of files sitting in those dark cabinets upstairs. Thousands of families still waiting in the dark for a phone call that says the ground has given up its secrets. You've shown them that the system can work, that time isn't a permanent shield for the guilty, and that the truth has enough gravity to pull the whole house of cards down if you just refuse to let it go." The conclusion of the case brought no dramatic celebrations or public award ceremonies for the task force. It was marked by a quiet, professional return to the baseline operational rhythm of the Bureau. Lynn walked back to One Police Plaza alone, the heavy summer air hitting her face like a physical barrier as she navigated the packed sidewalks of Lower Manhattan. She ascended to the 8th floor, stepped into the secure digital archives unit, and inserted the master drive into the central server array, initiating the final archiving sequence that would move the 2005 file from the active network to the permanent historical repository of the Department of Justice. The progress bar on the monitor crawled toward 100%, the green segments illuminating the screen with a steady, rhythmic pulse that felt entirely appropriate for the clinical conclusion of the manhunt. When the notification flared, case status, closed, archival complete, Lynn hit the terminal switch, letting the monitors fade into an absolute, silent black. The room was empty, the quiet bullpen outside her office already humming with the logistical preparation for newer cases, newer crimes, and the infinite, chaotic demands of a city that never stops moving. The city of New York would continue its frantic, indifferent march into the future, its infrastructure expanding, its roads getting wider, and its populations shifting across the tri-state area without ever looking back at the tragedies that lay buried beneath its concrete foundations. The bridge pillars of the Meadowlands bypass would continue to carry thousands of high-velocity vehicles an hour, their drivers entirely oblivious to the fact that a team of scientists had dropped into the dark earth beneath their tires to extract the material proof of a 21-year-old horror. But the ledger was balanced. The 19-year-old schoolteacher was no longer a missing persons flyer fading on a precinct bulletin board. She had been rescued from the opacity of the past, her name restored to the history of her lineage, and her family finally, at long last, granted the simple, quiet, and unburdened right to leave the dark behind and step into the light of an untroubled future. The archiving of the 2005 case file was meant to draw a thick, bureaucratic curtain over the tragedy of Elm Street, but the ripples of Arthur Pendleton's midnight exposure continued to fracture the institutional complacency of law enforcement across the entire eastern seaboard. In the scorching heat of late June 2026, the Special Victims Bureau at One Police Plaza found itself transformed into an analytical hub for regional cold case units. Detective Sarah Lynn's desk was no longer buried under property deeds from New Jersey. Instead, it was piled high with requests for consultation from homicide divisions in Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and upstate New York. The tactical and scientific methodology that had dismantled Pendleton's 21-year-old fortress of deception had become a master template, an operational blueprint for an era where time was no longer a viable shield for the guilty. Lynn stood before a freshly wiped whiteboard in the Bureau's auxiliary briefing room, her markers tracing a complex network of logic models, extraction timelines, and database criteria. Gathered around the long oak table were 6 veteran investigators from neighboring jurisdictions, their expressions a mix of professional curiosity and deep, internalized frustration. They were men and women who had spent decades carrying their own phantoms, unsolved abductions, phantom tire tracks, and unidentified remains that sat in cardboard evidence boxes in the damp basements of their respective precincts. They had watched the live broadcasts of the Meadowlands bypass excavation with a sense of profound, personal shock, and they had traveled to Manhattan to understand exactly how the task force had managed to turn a microscopic, degraded touch DNA sample into an unassailable federal indictment. "The paradigm has shifted completely, gentlemen," Lynn said, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of the building's heavy air conditioning units with a sharp, clinical authority. "For the last 40 years, policing relied on a linear equation: find a witness, find a physical footprint at the scene, find a matching profile in Cody's. If the suspect didn't have a prior felony conviction, or if the initial laboratory could not extract a clean STR profile from a door handle, the equation broke down and the file stagnated. But genetic genealogy doesn't care about prior convictions, and next-generation sequencing doesn't require a pristine biological sample. We are no longer chasing individuals. We are mapping lineages. We are treating the human bloodline as an interconnected public registry, and every time a relative uploads their saliva into an ancestry database to discover their European origins, they are inadvertently signing a warrant for the monster hiding in their family tree." She turned to the board, tapping a diagram that illustrated the extraction process used on the Elm Street latch. The defense will always attack the abandonment theory. They will claim that surreptitious collection is an evasion of the Fourth Amendment. But as long as your tactical unit documents the public nature of the disposal, whether it's a discarded coffee cup in a bakery or a cigarette but dropped on a public sidewalk, the legal foundation remains unassailable. The key is structural synchronization. You cannot present the DNA in a vacuum. You must anchor it to historical logistics. You find the telemetry data, you locate the old payroll records, and you build a physical cage around the target before you ever step into a judge's chambers to request a dynamic midnight warrant. While Lynn trained the regional task forces in the mechanics of modern forensic mobilization, Detective Thomas Vance was experiencing the disorienting, profound silence of his new civilian existence. He had spent his entire adult life reacting to the frantic, high-frequency internal sirens of active police work, his mind permanently locked into a state of hypervigilant anticipation. Now, walking through the crowded morning markets of Lower Manhattan without a shield pinned to his belt or a Glock secured beneath his jacket, he felt like a deep-sea diver who had ascended to the surface too quickly, his internal pressure struggling to adapt to the thin, unburdened atmosphere of ordinary life. He found himself drawn back to the physical arenas of his old failures, not out of a sense of lingering obsession, but out of a quiet, meditative need to witness the transformation of the landscape. He took a regional transit train out to the New Jersey suburbs, stepping off the platform into the midday heat of the valley that had birthed the 2005 mystery. He walked the tree-lined avenues of Elm Street, his boots crunching against the loose gravel of the newly paved sidewalks. The neighborhood looked remarkably ordinary, the houses a uniform display of suburban comfort, the children playing on the lawns completely oblivious to the fact that the old silver-haired man walking past their fences was the investigator who had spent 21 years hunting the phantom who once lived at the end of their block. Vance stopped at the perimeter of Pendleton's former property. The split-level home had been completely stripped of its architectural identity by the new owners, the familiar green shutters replaced by minimalist dark siding, the overgrown hedges where police dogs had frantically searched for scents completely uprooted and replaced by clean stone retaining walls. The transformation was an act of deliberate cultural sanitization, a collective effort by the community to erase the physical coordinates of an atrocity from their daily lives. Yet, as Vance stared at the front porch light cutting through the glare of the noon sun, he knew that the soil of Elm Street would always hold the memory of that July afternoon, an invisible scar that would continue to define the history of the valley for generations to come. He walked down to the corner of the block where the municipal mailbox stood, its blue metal surface faded and chipped by decades of winter ice and summer humidity. This was the exact spot where the schoolteacher's trajectory had been violently severed from the earth, the precise physical node where a life of vibrant promise had collided with the cold, unyielding malice of a passing delivery van. Vance reached out, his calloused hand resting on the hot iron of the mailbox lid, his eyes closing as he listened to the distant, ambient sounds of the neighborhood, the laughter of children, the drone of lawnmowers, the steady hum of traffic moving toward the highway bypass. The noise was no longer a mocking reminder of his failure. It was a peaceful, liberating symphony that confirmed the world had finally been restored to its proper balance. "You can rest now, kid," Vance whispered into the warm afternoon wind, his words a quiet, final benediction to the ghost that had kept him company through 21 years of sleepless nights and broken marriages. "We brought you out of the concrete. We put the monster in a hole he's never coming out of. The watch is officially over." Back at One Police Plaza, the digital integration of the regional task forces was yielding its first major dividends. The analytical models Lynn had established on her whiteboard were being applied to dozens of dormant files across the state, triggering a series of automated hits within the public genealogical networks that caused cold case units from Buffalo to Long Island to scramble their surveillance teams. The methodology was no longer an experimental luxury. It was a routine, highly efficient element of the department's daily operational rhythm, an unyielding dragnet that was quietly closing around phantoms who had spent decades convinced that their crimes had been successfully absorbed by the collective amnesia of the city. Lynn stood by the high-arched windows of her office, watching the long shadows of the late afternoon stretch across the plaza below. The sun was dipping behind the skyscrapers of the financial district, casting a pale, copper glow over the concrete expanse where thousands of commuters were rushing toward the subway entrances, their movements synchronized to the frantic, unrelenting heartbeat of Manhattan. She knew that her work in the Special Victims Bureau would continue, that the tomorrow would bring newer files, newer horrors, and newer demands for her clinical, scientific intervention. The city would never stop producing darkness, and it would never stop building over its tragedies. But as she looked down at the empty desktop where the massive cardboard boxes of the 2005 investigation had sat for so many years, she felt an unshakable, permanent sense of professional peace. The account was balanced. The data had achieved its maximum velocity, the molecular signature had delivered its indictment, and the unyielding persistence of human will had successfully dragged a 30-year-old truth out of the subterranean darkness of the Meadowlands bypass. The 19-year-old schoolteacher was no longer a statistic or a ghost story told in hushed tones around suburban campfires. She was a complete, dignified historical reality, her memory rescued from the concrete, her family finally granted the sacred, untroubled right to leave the dark behind them and step forward into the light of an unburdened dawn. The shockwave of the Arthur Pendleton plea agreement did not merely reset the operational baseline for the New York Task Force. It triggered a profound, cascading transformation within the judicial architecture of the entire United States federal court system. As the summer of 2026 deepened, the legal briefs, technical motions, and procedural guidelines developed during the hunt for the Elm Street Predator became the foundational curriculum for the Department of Justice's newly formed Bureau of Forensic Genomics. The case was no longer categorized as a localized cold case victory. It was recognized as a historic precedent, an unassailable legal benchmark that defined exactly how far the state could reach into the genetic history of a family line to extract the hidden coordinates of an ancient atrocity. Inside the federal courthouse on Pearl Street, the administrative fallout manifested as a quiet, relentless restructuring of investigative protocols. Detective Sarah Lynn found herself increasingly split between her active casework at one police plaza and the high-altitude demands of federal oversight committees in Washington. Her days were spent testifying before congressional subcommittees on privacy, her level, clinical voice cutting through the highly politicized, abstract anxieties of lawmakers who were struggling to comprehend the rapid acceleration of next-generation DNA technology. She didn't offer philosophical defenses of the system. She spoke in the unyielding language of data points, base pairs, and statistical probabilities, presenting the physical artifacts of the 2005 recovery as the ultimate justification for the state's methodology. The question before us is not whether we are entering an era of genetic surveillance, Lynn stated, her gaze unwavering as she looked out over the crowded congressional hearing room from the witness podium. The reality is that the data already exists. It sits in public databases, uploaded voluntarily by millions of individuals seeking connection to their past. The question is whether law enforcement will be permitted to utilize that existing public ledger to balance the accounts for victims who have been violently denied a future. When Arthur Pendleton left his touch DNA on the door handle of that kitchen on Elm Street, he did not create a new privacy interest. He abandoned his identity at a crime scene. To bar the state from utilizing modern technology to trace that abandoned signature back to its source is to declare that a killer's right to camouflage is superior to a community's right to justice. While the legal battle lines were being codified into federal statutory law, the physical landscape of the valley that had birthed the 2005 tragedy was settling into an unfamiliar, quiet equilibrium. In the suburban developments of New Jersey, the hypervigilant paranoia that had defined the immediate aftermath of the midnight raid was slowly mutating into a somber, institutional respect for the passage of time. The younger generation of homeowners on Elm Street, who had bought into the neighborhood for its modern schools and manicured parks, looked at the blue municipal mailbox at the corner not as a symbol of active terror, but as a historical landmark, a monument to an era when a predatory shadow could move through the valley without leaving an immediate digital trace. The family of the schoolteacher had long since faded from the local civic registry, their surviving members scattered across the western states, but the impact of her return was deeply visible in the philanthropic foundations that had been established using the liquidated assets of Pendleton's logistics firm. The federal court had ordered the absolute forfeiture of his corporate shares, real estate holdings, and pension plans, transferring millions of dollars into a permanent trust managed by the state library system. The trust financed summer reading programs, mobile learning laboratories, and educational scholarships for underprivileged children across 3 counties, a systematic, structural transformation that turned the financial legacy of a monster into an engine of communal growth and intellectual promise. For retired Detective Thomas Vance, the high-velocity transition into civilian isolation had finally reached a point of gentle, unburdened stabilization. He no longer spent his afternoons walking the rocky shorelines of the river with a racing heart. He had bought a small wood-frame cottage on the western ridge of the valley, just a few miles from the timberlines where he had once tracked the false alibis of his youth. He spent his days restoring old furniture, his calloused hands moving across the rough timber with the same patience and precision he had once applied to the yellowed pages of his 1985 logbooks. The toxic obsession that had cost him his youth and fractured his domestic life had been thoroughly spent, replaced by a quiet, meditative peace that allowed him to look at the mountain sunsets without searching the shadows for a phantom. Vance kept a single, framed photograph on the mantelpiece of his stone fireplace. Not an image of the crime scene or a rendering of the forensic evidence, but a simple, black-and-white portrait of the schoolteacher taken during her college graduation, her eyes bright with a hopeful, unwritten future that had ultimately been rescued from the dark of the Meadowlands Foundation. Every morning, as he lit the kindling for his stove, he would look at the picture, a silent nod of recognition between an old investigator who had finished his watch and a victim who had finally been brought home to her proper place within the memory of her community. "The ground doesn't feel cold anymore, Tom," Lynn said to him over the phone on a quiet Tuesday evening in late July, her voice carrying the ambient hum of the precinct bullpen in the background. "We ran the quarterly statistics for the regional task force today. The methodology we built for the 2005 file has already triggered 5 indictments in upstate cases that had been dormant since the mid-90s. The net is tightening everywhere." Vance smiled, leaning back against the wooden frame of his porch chair, listening to the rhythmic chirping of the crickets rising from the deep grass of the ridge. "The net was always there, Sarah," he replied softly, his gravelly voice filled with a deep, systemic contentment. "We just had to wait for the world to grow enough to see it. You keep your eyes on the terminal, kid. Don't let them tell you a file is too old to look at. The data is just waiting for someone with enough stubbornness to make it speak." Inside the secure digital archives block of One Police Plaza, the progress markers for the 2005 investigation remained locked at 100%, the green indicators glowing steadily against the darkness of the terminal room. The server was silent, an unyielding vault of binary code that held the definitive history of a tragedy, a triumph, and a 30-year debt that had finally been paid in full under the cover of a moonless sky. The city of New York continued its frantic, indifferent sprawl into the future, its concrete arteries carrying thousands of high-velocity lives across the tri-state area every hour. But within the secure parameters of the law, the ledger remained perfectly balanced, a permanent declaration that no crime is too ancient, no secret is too deep, and no voice can ever be permanently silenced when an unyielding truth decides to claim its own. The seamless, high-voltage narration continues without pause, shifting its focus toward the broader, systemic impact of the Pendleton conviction on federal cold case infrastructure across the nation. The administrative closing of the 2005 case file did not mark a cessation of hostilities between the state and the phantoms of the past. It acted as the official catalyst for a nationwide mobilization of genomic assets. By the autumn of 2026, the Department of Justice had finalized the deployment of the Vance-Lynn Protocol, a standardized federal directive that mandated the immediate re-extraction and next-generation sequencing of every touch DNA sample recovered from unsolved abductions across the continental United States. The methodology that had broken Arthur Pendleton's camouflage was no longer treated as an exceptional break. It was now the law of the land, an unyielding, industrial dragnet that converted the biological history of the nation into a high-resolution forensic matrix. In the regional precinct houses from Chicago to Atlanta, old cabinets were unlocked, dust was brushed away from ancient cardboard containers, and analysts dropped to their knees to retrieve files that had been classified as unresolvable for half a century. Homicide detectives who had spent their entire careers carrying the heavy, toxic weight of dead ends found themselves on secure video links with Lynn's team at One Police Plaza, learning how to synchronize their historical logistics maps with the digital lineages of public ancestry networks. The atmosphere across the country was electric with the energy of a historic transition, a collective realization that the walls of silence built by the predators of the late 20th century were experiencing a systematic, scientific demolition. Inside the State Pathology Laboratory in Albany, the cleanroom units were running 24 hours a day, the automated sequencing machines humming with a low, constant vibration that felt like the heartbeat of a massive retributive machine. Dr. Eris Thorne stood before a wall of liquid crystal monitors, his eyes tracking the digital alignment of base pairs extracted from a dozen different cold cases across the eastern seaboard. The data was moving across secure federal networks with the speed of an electric current, transforming the forgotten remnants of old tragedies into dynamic, targeted descriptions of living suspects who had spent decades convinced that the passage of time had sanitized their lives. "We are witnessing the absolute evaporation of anonymity for the criminal elite," Dr. Thorne noted during a closed-door presentation to the National Institute of Justice. "The individual who commits a violent act and believes they can dissolve into the baseline noise of a modern metropolis is operating on an obsolete premise. They are relying on the limitations of 1985 policing while living in a 2026 surveillance ecosystem. Every time they step onto a public street, every time they discard a container, and every time their distant third cousin submits a saliva sample to discover a geographical origin, they are transmitting their own indictment directly to our servers. The timeline has caught up to them, and the distance between the sin and the cage has been reduced to a simple mathematical certainty." The socio-legal impact of this scientific revolution was particularly profound within the legal profession. Elite defense firms, accustomed to utilizing the erosion of memory and the degradation of material evidence to secure acquittals for their high-paying clients, found themselves facing an unassailable wall of empirical certainty. The old strategies of character mitigation and procedural technicalities were rendered useless against the crushing weight of a 1 in 700 trillion statistical match supported by GPS tracking data and recovered trophies. The legal landscape had become binary. A suspect was either completely cleared by the genomic sequencing, or they were forced into immediate, absolute capitulation within federal chambers to avoid the total public exposure of a capital trial. As the winter of 2026 began to settle over the northeastern corridors, bringing a clean, white blanket of snow that covered the concrete structures of the Meadowlands bypass and the suburban avenues of Elm Street, the true depth of the Pendleton legacy became clear. The case was no longer just a narrative of a single schoolteacher rescued from an industrial foundation. It was the birth of an era of absolute accountability. The ground of the city was no longer perceived as a safe vault for the secrets of the guilty. It was understood to be a temporary custodian, holding on to the evidence of violence only until the relentless march of human intellect developed the keys necessary to demand its surrender. Lynn stood by her window at One Police Plaza on New Year's Eve, watching the snow fall over the crowded expanse of Foley Square below. The sirens of distant patrol cars cut through the freezing air, a reminder that the city would never stop generating friction, that the night would always bring newer crimes, newer horrors, and newer demands for her clinical intervention. But as she looked down at her spotless desk, completely cleared of the historical burdens that had defined her early career, she felt an unshakable, permanent sense of professional fulfillment. The net was secure, the science was locked, and the phantoms of the past were being systematically run to ground. The long winter of the 2005 cold case had finally ended, leaving behind a legacy of unyielding light that would continue to shine across the infrastructure of the city, a permanent guarantee that the truth would always have the absolute, final, and everlasting word.